There is something people get wrong about men who rule through fear. They assume that fear is what those men are made of, that it fills them up so completely, there's no room left for anything else. What I've learned, the hard way, the only way anything real gets learned, is that the most frightening men are often the hungriest, not for power, not for more territory, or cleaner headlines, or the kind of authority that makes other men look away first. Hungry for something plain, something that asks nothing from them. And when a man like that finally finds it, finds the one thing that sits in his chest without a cost attached, he does not let it go easily. He does not share it. He does not forget where it came from. I didn't set up my bread cart at the Halifax waterfront farmers market because I'd failed somewhere else and landed there by default. That matters to me, still. I want that clear. I had trained in 3 kitchens, 2 in Montreal and 1 in Toronto, and I had been good in all 3, good enough to matter to the people I worked for, which is exactly the problem with being good in someone else's kitchen. Your hands do the work, and their name goes on the window. I left the last place after a chef I had respected told me, in front of the full line on a Friday night, that if I wanted to run my own menu someday, I should start by learning how to be less difficult. I wasn't difficult, I was precise. There's a difference, and he knew it, which is why the comment stung worse than a burn. So I came home to Halifax. I got a vendor permit and a second-hand cart, and I found a corner spot at the Saturday market down by the boardwalk, between a woman named Colette, who sold wildflower jam, and an older man who had been selling smoked fish at that market since before I was born. I baked through Thursday nights and set up before 6 on Saturdays. My grandmother's sourdough, the one she'd been making since she came to Nova Scotia from Brittany in 1971, using a starter she'd kept alive through moves and winters, and the kind of poverty that doesn't leave much room for sentiment. That starter was 60 years old. I kept it in the back of my refrigerator, in a jar, with a piece of masking tape on the lid that said "Do not touch this" in both official languages. The bread sold because it was real. There was no trick to it, no specialty grain or fashionable addition. Just the ferment, the thyme, the Nova Scotia sea salt, and the kind of crust that sounded the way good bread is supposed to sound when you press the heel of your thumb into it. People came back for it. That was enough. I ran my corner the way I had always wanted to run a kitchen. Short menu, no substitutions, no apologies. If you arrived after 10:30, the dark rye was already gone, and that was your problem for sleeping in, not mine. People learned fast, or they didn't come back, and either way suited me. I had regulars who planned their Saturday mornings around the market schedule. I had walk-ins who found the line and assumed something remarkable was happening at the front of it. I had the occasional man who thought that arriving with a certain kind of confidence would get him an extra portion or a warmer reception than the person ahead of him in the queue. Those men learned the fastest of all. By the time I had worked that corner for 8 months, Colette from the jam stall had started placing small bets with the smoked fish man about how long it would take new customers to understand the rules. I didn't find out about this until February, and I chose to be flattered. The morning everything changed started the way the best Saturday mornings always do. Clear and cold, the kind of November cold that comes in off the harbor, carrying salt and the smell of tide, and I had 4 loaves in the warmer and a full pot of bone broth on the burner, because I had started offering broth with torn bread as a pairing the previous autumn, and it had become the thing people came for most when the temperature dropped. There is nothing complicated about it. Good bread, good broth. The bread does the work of telling you the broth is honest, and the broth does the work of telling you the bread was worth the wait. Together they are the simplest argument I know for why food matters. I was halfway through my first wave of customers when the quiet started. It wasn't a real quiet. The market never went silent, not with the harbor wind and the kids and the coffee vendors calling out order numbers across the square. But there is a quality to the sound of a crowd when something changes the air, a thinning, a redistribution of attention, and I recognized it the way you recognize a shift in weather before you can name what's coming. 3 black SUVs moved along the waterfront road and slowed near the market entrance. In Halifax, that is not an everyday sight. We are not a city that runs on tinted windows. Colette stopped talking mid-sentence. The smoked fish man, who had seen everything in 30 years at that market, took a small step back from his table. A woman somewhere behind me made the small adjustment of pulling her child closer without seeming to decide to do it. 2 men in dark coats got out first, then a third from the rear vehicle, and they arranged themselves in the easy, deliberate way of people whose job is to make sure the person they protect can exist in public without threat. Not aggressive, just precise. Then the door of the center SUV opened and I saw him. He didn't move quickly. He sat for a moment with one hand resting near the open frame, and that stillness told me more than the vehicles had. Men who need to be seen arriving don't sit still. They fill the moment. This one was conserving something. Rationing it. Dark coat, no tie, broad through the shoulders, but not in a way that announced itself. Face that had been handsome before something harder had settled into it and made it more interesting. He was somewhere in his late 30s, and he moved like a man carrying weight that was not visible. One of his men produced a paper bag, the kind that comes from the sort of downtown restaurant that prints its logo small, because the name is supposed to be enough. The man from the SUV took it without looking at whoever had handed it to him. He opened the bag, and the smell reached me even across the distance between us. Cream, reduction, something expensive that had been traveling in a car, long enough to go slightly off temperature and lose whatever it was supposed to be. He looked at the container inside for a long moment, then he closed the bag. I watched one of his men try to hand it back. He ignored him. His hand pressed lightly against the left side of his abdomen, in the small, almost hidden way people press at something that hurts, without wanting the room to notice. I noticed because reading a person's body before they speak is something you learn in a professional kitchen, or you don't last through your first winter service. I turned back to my broth. I don't know exactly what it was. People will tell you stories afterwards about instinct and impulse, about knowing things before you know them, and most of the time those stories are reconstructions. We layer meaning over ordinary decisions once the outcome is clear. What I know for certain is that I looked at a man who could not bring himself to eat food that had been brought for him, and I reached for a clean bowl. I tore a piece of bread, one of the round loaves, still warm from the bag, and placed it in the bowl and ladled broth over it. Not much, just enough for the bread to soften at the edges while staying intact in the middle, the way my grandmother made it for me when I was sick as a child. I covered the bowl and walked out from behind my cart and across the space between us, before I had time to talk myself out of it. The nearest man moved to block me immediately. He had good instincts and I didn't take it personally. "That food," I said, nodding toward the paper bag, "is not going to help him." He looked at me the way people look at things they're deciding whether to remove. "Whatever is in there is too rich," I said. "It's been sitting too long and it's too heavy. He needs something simpler." "Step back," he said. I looked past him, directly at the man from the SUV, who had turned toward us and was watching with the focused, uncurious attention of someone who has learned to monitor everything, because everything has already surprised him at least once. "I'm a baker," I said, loudly enough to carry. "That broth is bone broth, the bread is sourdough, no dairy, no butter on it. Nothing that's going to make whatever is already wrong feel worse." The bodyguard shifted his stance. The man from the SUV said, "Let her through." His voice was low and rougher than I'd expected, with the faint trace of somewhere else in the vowels. Eastern European, I thought, worn down to almost nothing by years. He said the 4 words like they cost nothing, and everyone around him responded like they cost everything. I stepped closer and held up the bowl. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at me, not the way men usually look at women who have stepped unexpectedly into their afternoon, not assessing, not dismissive, just direct and very tired and slightly puzzled. "What is it?" he asked. "Sourdough with bone broth," I said. 60-year-old starter, if that means anything to you. Sea salt, no stock powder, no additives. I know what went into it because I made it this morning." He glanced down at the bowl again. Something moved across his face. Not quite doubt and not quite hunger, something in between. "Why?" he asked. "Because you're not going to eat what's in that bag," I said. "And you should eat something." One of his men made a sound. The man himself didn't react to it. He reached out and took the bowl from my hands. He tore a small piece of bread, let it sit on his tongue for a moment before he swallowed, and I watched, because I have always watched how people take the first bite. It tells you more than any review ever will. His shoulders dropped by a centimeter, maybe less, his jaw unclenched, the hand at his side eased. He took another piece, then another. By the fourth, he had stopped examining the bowl between bites. When he finished, he held it out to me. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sabine," I said, and held out my other hand. His eyes dropped to it. $16, I said, for the bowl and the broth. Something almost happened to his face, not quite a smile, something more like the memory of one. He reached into his coat and held out a 50. I took 16, folded the rest, and offered it back. "I don't charge extra because someone arrives in a fleet of vehicles," I said. He took the money back slowly, looking at me the whole time. "Is that a regular policy?" "It's a reasonable one." Behind me I could hear Colette, pretending not to vibrate with excitement. He looked at the market, then back at me. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'm here Saturdays," I said. "And if you want the same thing, the line starts at the back." I walked back to my cart. The market sound came back in pieces. Voices first, then movement, then someone near the front of my queue, letting out a long breath they had apparently been holding for the duration of that entire exchange. Colette leaned over between customers and asked, very quietly, whether I had any idea who that was. I told her I hadn't recognized him. She made the sign of the cross and told me his name was Nikolai Varden. She said it in the tone you use when you're saying the name of something the city knows better than to touch. I had heard it before, the way you hear certain names in Halifax. In the background of things, in the spaces between proper sentences, attached to stories that stopped before they finished, port operations and real estate, and the kind of business interests that the news reported on carefully, using language that proved nothing and implied everything. He had come from somewhere else, Prague, someone had told me once, though I'd never had reason to verify it, and he had been here long enough that the city had adjusted around him, the way water adjusts around a stone placed in a river. I told myself on the walk to my car that afternoon that it was over, that I had given food to a stranger who needed it, taken his $16, and returned to my work, and that was the whole story. I have always been good at telling myself clean versions of complicated things. It usually works until it doesn't. He sent someone the following Saturday instead of coming himself. Not a bodyguard. A man in his 50s, silver at the temples, with a pleasant face that I nearly trusted before I noticed his eyes, the kind of eyes that stay very still while the rest of the face moves. He introduced himself as Ivor. He said most people called him that, and something in the way he said it suggested he was aware that most people being referred to were not most people at all. He said Nikolai would like a meal prepared. I said no. He didn't look surprised. He put a card on my cart anyway, thick paper, one phone number, one address, printed in the understated way of things that don't need to announce how expensive they are. Then he told me that the soup I had handed through a car window on Saturday had been the first full meal Nikolai Varden had managed without pain in nearly 4 years. I kept my hands on the broth ladle. 4 years, Ivor said, was a long time for a man to fight every table he sat at. He said there had been an incident, a dinner. Someone trusted had placed something in a dish meant for 2, and the other man at the table had died before the ambulance arrived. Nikolai had not. His body had survived what his body was given, but it had never fully processed the distinction between nourishment and what had almost ended him. Doctors had terms for it. Specialists had opinions. None of it had made much practical difference at a table. I asked who the trusted person was. Ivor's expression didn't shift much. He said it was a former associate. Someone who had been close enough to know exactly what was being put in the food and exactly who would be eating it. That answer landed differently than I expected it to. There is a particular kind of damage that comes from having been hurt most precisely by the person whose job was to keep you safe, and I had seen enough of it in different forms. In kitchens, in families, in the small stories people told me while waiting in line, to recognize the shape of it even when I couldn't see the wound directly. I said I had conditions. Ivor said he expected so. I told him I wasn't taking a job with anyone. I would keep my own schedule. I would choose the dish. I would bring my own ingredients because I did not cook from a pantry. I hadn't stocked myself. I would leave when I was done, and I would not be followed home afterwards. And if at any point, anyone hovering over my shoulder told me to add something or change something, or suggested that the man I was cooking for would prefer it a different way, I would leave before the pot came off the heat. Ivor listened without interrupting. Then he said 7 o'clock. I said yes because the 4 years had sat somewhere in my chest and hadn't moved yet. The building was in the south end, old brick trying to look like it wasn't keeping secrets, which is different from succeeding. A door attendant knew my name before I gave it. That told me 2 things simultaneously. They had looked into me already, and I was not unsettled by that the way I probably should have been. Both of those facts were worth examining later. I put them aside. Ivor met me at the door and took me up to a kitchen that was the size of my apartment and had never been cooked in, which I could tell by the placement of everything and the particular quality of the surfaces. Beautiful kitchens that nobody uses have a specific kind of clean. Not the clean of maintenance, but the clean of absence. Nikolai came in while I was unpacking. Different from the market, no coat, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the formal version of himself left somewhere else. He was harder to read in his own space, which is always true of people who have learned to be dangerous quietly. He watched me put my things on the counter and said I'd brought my own flour. I said I didn't know his pantry. He asked if I thought it was unsafe. I said I thought trust was earned in both directions. That answer landed somewhere. I saw it in the brief stillness that followed, the way he set it down in himself without showing where it went. I made him sourdough toast, dark rye variation, with white beans and fresh thyme, and broth alongside, simple food. Food that didn't need to perform. When I told him to sit, he sat, which surprised me more than it should have. He looked at the plate for a moment, in the way people look at doors they want to be unlocked, but aren't entirely sure they can trust the handle. Then he picked up the fork. The change was small enough that most people would have missed it. I didn't miss it. The breath he took after the 3rd bite was a different breath than the one before. His shoulders settled, the compressed line of his mouth eased by the smallest fraction. He finished the plate and looked up at me. I'd forgotten what it felt like, he said, to eat something and not wait for the consequence. It was such a flat, honest sentence. He said it the way you say something that has been true for so long you've stopped being dramatic about it. I looked away because I didn't know what to do with the reaction that came up in me, something that was not quite sympathy and not quite recognition, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. I told him that was a miserable thing to say in a kitchen with this much counter space. He was quiet for a moment then. Is it less miserable if I say it in a worse kitchen? It's less miserable if you don't have to say it anymore, I said. He looked at me then in a way I filed away and didn't examine until later. We talked while I cleaned. He guessed correctly that I'd worked in professional kitchens. He said I moved like someone trained under pressure. I told him about the 3 kitchens, about the chef in Montreal who put his name on a sauce I'd developed over an entire season, about leaving the Toronto place because a co-owner had a habit of managing the women on staff through proximity and misplaced hands, and calling it mentorship. Nikolai asked for the name of the 2nd man, with a stillness in his voice that made me answer without thinking, and then immediately tell him to forget it. 7 years ago, I said, let it go. He didn't argue. He just held the information in a place I couldn't see. Before I left, he asked if I would come back. I said no. He asked why. I told him because if I came into his life regularly, sooner or later his world and my name would end up in the same sentence, and I had worked too hard building something on my own to have it defined by association with a man whose business I didn't want to know the full shape of. He absorbed that without argument. He wrote a number on the back of one of my order slips and handed it across the counter. If you change your mind, he said. I took the slip. I left. I made it 2 blocks south before a car I hadn't heard approach rolled alongside me, and a window came down. There were 3 men inside. Not Nikolai's men. I knew that immediately, the same way you know the difference between the cold that comes off the harbor and the cold that comes out of a storage locker. These ones were watching me with the particular kind of blankness that is actually the opposite of blankness. The one nearest the window said their employer would like to speak with me. I said I was busy. He said it wouldn't take long. I said no. He looked past me toward the building I had come from and said almost pleasantly that Nikolai Varden kept unusual company these days. I stepped back, the rear door of the car unlocked with a quiet click. "You're not getting in that car." Ivor's voice, from somewhere just behind my left shoulder. I turned enough to see him standing a few feet away, two of Nikolai's men slightly behind him, positioned without urgency or display. The man in the window looked at Ivor for a moment. Then he said something I didn't fully catch. Something about choices, and about what happened to things that mattered to certain people. Then the car moved. Ivor walked me back toward the building. He told me they had likely been watching the block already, which made it worse rather than better. He told me the man in the window worked for a competitor named Decker Foss. And when I asked whether that meant Decker Foss now saw me as a useful point of pressure, Ivor didn't lie. He said yes. I was still processing that when another door opened and Nikolai came out, coat on now, face colder than it had been upstairs. He stopped beside me and looked down the street where the car had gone. "They spoke to you," he said. I turned to him. "They spoke to me because you and I have now had dinner. Those are related facts." He didn't flinch. "Yes." "So what exactly is the arrangement here?" I said, "where I cook a meal and your enemies start using me as a variable?" "You're in danger because you were seen with me," he said, "not because of anything you've done, and that makes it my responsibility." "That's a convenient definition of responsibility," I said. "It's an accurate one." He looked at me steadily. "Your building has one working camera. The side gate near the parking lot hasn't latched properly in at least 3 weeks. Those are not things you can make safe tonight on your own." I stared at him. "How do you know about my gate?" A brief pause. The kind that tells you the answer was something they hadn't decided to share yet. "You had me looked into," I said. "Before I let Ivor give you my address," he said. It was almost an apology, not quite. I crossed my arms. "And you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" "I'm mentioning it now." I said several things about that, not all of them measured. He listened to all of them without interrupting, which was either patience or strategy, and I wasn't sure which I preferred. When I finished, he said that, whatever I thought of his methods, Decker Foss was not someone whose intentions improved with time, and that my apartment, being 15 minutes from where I was currently standing, was not a safe enough distance for the next few hours. I hated that his logic was right. I hated more that he knew I could see it was right. He opened the rear door of the waiting car himself. Not a command, a statement. The kind of statement that leaves the decision where it belongs, while making very clear that only one decision was going to result in a night anyone got through intact. I got in. The car took us to a townhouse in the North End. Older brick, tree-lined street, the kind of quiet that is expensive without announcing itself. Inside, books on the kitchen table, a coat on the back of a chair, a bowl of apples going slightly soft on the counter, a jar of loose tea with the lid not quite shut. All the evidence of a person who actually lived there, which surprised me because I had expected something that looked more like the kitchen he'd shown me earlier. Beautiful, sterile, useful for impressions only. This was a different kind of room. It felt occupied, it felt real, and that made me more cautious than the building had. He told me what his men had confirmed. My building had been under observation twice in the past week. One of the cameras on my block had picked up Decker's car, circling 2 nights before I had ever set foot in the South End building. Either they had been tracking Nikolai very closely and found me the moment something changed, or someone with information had moved faster than they should have. I said I loved how calmly he discussed the possibility of a leak before 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. He said calm was the only useful response to betrayal. Panic was for people who still had the luxury of being surprised. I made broth in his kitchen because he hadn't eaten since the meal I'd made him earlier, and he wasn't going to say so. I could tell by the way he stood at the counter, with one hand pressed slightly below his ribs. The same quiet gesture I had noticed from across a waterfront market, the body asking for something the mind was too accustomed to denying. He drank it without argument, standing at the counter in that room that felt like a real person's kitchen, and the look on his face, when the first few swallows stayed down, was the kind of look you file away, in the part of yourself you don't examine too closely. He said at some point after midnight that he hated being seen like this. I said men who thought vulnerability in front of one trustworthy person constituted weakness were exhausting. He didn't answer that, but he didn't argue either. Later, he asked if I would come back to the market. I said I had no intention of hiding from a man I had never met before last Saturday. He said he would come, stand in the line like anyone else. I told him if he came to my corner in a 3-car convoy, I would charge him for the inconvenience to every other customer in my queue. Something eased in his face. 1 car, he said. No reserved order, last in line. Understood. When he arrived the following Saturday, he came on foot, which I had not expected, with Ivor and one other man far enough behind to constitute a reasonable fiction of ordinary. The market noticed him immediately but differently than it had before. Not with the thinning silence of threat, but with the complicated attention of a neighborhood processing an anomaly. He took his place at the end of my line. He waited. The crossing guard across the road nearly stepped into traffic because he was watching. I didn't give him special treatment. I took orders, managed the loaves, redirected 2 people who tried to push in from the side, handed the regulars their usual without needing to be asked. When Nikolai reached the front, I asked him what he wanted. He looked at the board for a moment, then he looked at me. You choose, he said. I should have been able to treat that as an ordinary request. I have chosen food for hundreds of people, thousands of times, but there is a particular weight to that phrase when it comes from a person who has spent 4 years unable to trust the thing being chosen, and I felt the weight of it in the space between my ribs where I don't usually let professional decisions land. I made him a sourdough open sandwich with white bean spread, fried capers, and lemon zest, with a cup of broth on the side. He stood at the edge of my cart and ate it there, which Colette would tell me later was the most noteworthy thing to happen at the market, since the year the smoked fish man accidentally started a small fire near the harbor railing. Decker's first move came 2 weeks later, and it came dressed as paperwork, which I should have expected. Men who run operations the way Deckerfoss ran Hanless learn early that the cheapest damage is damage that makes its target do the work. A City of Halifax bylaw compliance officer showed up on a Saturday morning with a noise complaint, 2 violations related to food cart clearance from the market walkway, and a query about whether my vendor permit covered the addition of hot liquid service. It was all nonsense. I had checked the clearance requirements when I applied for the permit, and rechecked them when I added the broth the previous autumn. My grandmother had kept meticulous records. I had inherited her habit. I pulled my permit folder from under the counter. Every original document, every renewal, every approval from the Halifax Regional Municipality dating back to my first season, organized in date order in clear sleeves. I laid them out on the cart surface one at a time while my queue watched, and the bylaw officer looked at each page with the expression of someone who has been asked to find something he already knows isn't there. When I finished, I asked whether there was an actual violation he needed to document, or whether we were finished. He gathered his papers and left. I knew it wasn't the end. The next move came on a Wednesday night, and it was less bureaucratic. The right side of my cart, the serving panel, the menu board I had painted myself the first winter, the small chalk space where I wrote the special when I had one, was scorched and warped when I arrived at the market before dawn on Thursday. Not destroyed, not burned to the ground, just damaged enough that I would have to spend money I had budgeted for something else, and marked in a way that every customer who came Saturday would see. I called no one. I stood in the empty market in the cold and looked at it for long enough that I was sure I'd understood it correctly, and then I went back to my car and sat there and let myself be angry in private before I had to be practical in public. The anger took about 4 minutes. The The practical part took longer. Nikolai arrived before I had finished processing either one. He was standing near the market entrance when I came back to assess the damage a second time, and when I turned and saw him, I said the thing that was truest in that moment, and the least fair. "This is because of you." He didn't argue. He said yes, just that. No excuse, no defense, no lie. The honesty of it hit harder than any argument would have. Then he looked at the scorched menu board, and then at me, and said he was going to end it. I said ending it didn't undo the Wednesday night. He said no, but it would prevent the Thursday after that. Ivor stepped forward then, quiet and deliberate in the way he always was, and said that Nikolai had a commercial property in Halifax's North End that had been sitting empty since a lease fell through the previous spring. A proper kitchen space. Ground floor, good light, independent entrance. It could be transferred to my name, my lease, my kitchen, my rules, his security arrangements on the perimeter, nothing that touched the inside. I looked at Ivor for a moment, then at Nikolai. "My name," I said, "on the lease." "Your name on the lease," Nikolai confirmed. I made them wait for the answer, because I had conditions, and the conditions mattered more than the speed. I said I would choose everything. The equipment placement, the lighting, the hours, the menu. I said if anyone from his side of this arrangement set foot inside without being invited, I would walk out and not come back. I said the property would be registered as a business I owned outright, with no financial connection to him, visible in any document. He agreed to each condition without trying to negotiate a single one. That, more than anything, told me what he was actually offering. I built the kitchen the way I had always wanted to build one. I chose an old Montague range and a proofer that fit along the east wall, and a zinc-topped prep counter that was long enough to feel like it had always been there. I picked the light fixtures, warm, practical, not decorative. I painted the entrance wall the same gray-blue as the Atlantic on a clear October morning, and I wrote the name above the door in my own handwriting. Audets. Nikolai didn't interfere. When I needed something, he sourced it without commentary. A better extraction hood, done. The flour delivery arrangement I had been trying to negotiate with a Nova Scotia miller for 2 years suddenly resolved. A set of heavy cast-iron pans, waiting in a box when I arrived one morning with my name on the delivery label. I told him, the evening I found the pans, that he wasn't subtle. He said he wasn't trying to be subtle, he was trying to be useful. I told him there was a line between the two that mattered. He said he was aware, then he asked, carefully, whether the pans were the wrong side of the line. I looked at them for a moment. They were exactly the right weight, and the right seasoning and the right size for the kind of cooking I wanted to do. I told him no, the pans were the right side. Something shifted in his face that I filed away under the same category as all the other things I was collecting without examining. The attempt on the kitchen came 11 days before I opened. It was a quiet evening. I was testing a new broth recipe. Longer roast on the bones, added kombu for depth, and Ivor was at the far end of the space reading something on his phone and pretending he wasn't watching the street through the window. The kitchen smelled the way kitchens are supposed to smell, warm and layered and honest. I uncapped the bottle of finishing oil I kept on the upper shelf, a cold-pressed canola from a producer outside Wolfville that I had used for 2 years without issue, and tipped it toward the pan. The smell stopped my hand. Not wrong in a dramatic way, wrong in the particular quiet way of something that has been altered in a minor key, something that had been changed just enough to change everything and no more. Flat where it should have been round. A thin metallic edge under the grass-green top note, tiny, the kind of thing you only catch if you've been smelling the same oil for long enough to know exactly what it sounds like, which is a strange way to think about smell. But that is how smell works for people who work with food seriously. I set the bottle down. "Don't touch anything on this counter," I said. Ivor looked up immediately. Nikolai, who had come in 30 minutes earlier without my having asked him to, was on his feet before the sentence finished. The oil tested positive for a compound that Ivor described, in the flattest possible voice, as not immediately lethal in the quantities present, but sufficient to cause significant neurological disruption in someone who had already spent 4 years with a compromised digestive system. The bottle had been switched out earlier that day during a kitchen supply delivery. The money trail took less than 48 hours to trace to an account connected to Decker Foss's operation. Nikolai stood in the middle of my kitchen after Ivor finished the report and said nothing for a long moment. His face had the particular quality of rage that is too controlled to look like rage. He said Decker wasn't just trying to harm him. He was trying to recreate the exact shape of what had already broken him, to make trust itself feel like a weapon again, indefinitely, until the damage became cumulative enough to do the work from the inside. I stepped in front of him, before the silence could harden into something irreversible. "Look at me," I said. He did. "That bottle doesn't get tonight," I said. "Whatever happened 4 years ago doesn't get tonight either." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he lowered his forehead very slowly until it rested against mine, and he breathed, once, rough and deliberate and alive. The opening came on a Friday in March. I invited the market vendors, the regulars from the Saturday queue, Colette, and the smoked fish man and the crossing guard from the waterfront. The kitchen smelled like the starter, and like the sea salt, and like everything I had been building toward, since I left a restaurant where my name didn't go above the door. Decker's people came through the front window first, a bin lid thrown hard enough to shatter the glass and let the harbor cold in. 2 men from the service alley at the back within seconds. The room moved in that terrible compressed way. Rooms move when violence enters them. Everyone reduced to pure instinct, chairs going over, someone pulling someone else toward the floor. I got Colette behind the pass-through. The man who came through the kitchen entrance had a knife, and the particular confidence of someone who had never cooked in a room and didn't understand that a room built for cooking is a room full of precisely calibrated heat and weight. My hand found the handle of the cast iron pan on the burner. It had been there for 40 minutes. I didn't throw it. I just held it in a way that made the calculation very clear. He made a different decision. I was glad about that. Nikolai came through the front. Ivor was at the back. By the time Decker himself stepped through the broken window frame, older than I'd imagined him, smoother, with the kind of smile that has been practiced in front of mirrors, long enough to pass as genuine. The room had already narrowed to something manageable. Decker looked around my kitchen with the expression of someone who had purchased the right to be amused. "She built you a kitchen," he said to Nikolai, like it was a joke. Nikolai didn't answer. I understood then why people said what they said about his silence. It had a weight that a great deal of noise would have failed to match. Decker made the mistake of looking at me too long. The jar of pickling brine I had been working with earlier was on the shelf at my left hand, glass, full. It hit Decker across the side of the face before the thought had fully formed, and he went sideways into the counter with a sound like someone had removed the last support from a structure that had been leaning too long. That was enough of a window. Nikolai crossed the room in 3 steps and had Decker by the collar against the prep counter, and the stillness that came over him in that moment, the absolute, terrible calm of a man who had already made his decision, was the most frightening thing I had seen all evening. Not because I doubted what he was capable of, because I didn't. "Nikolai," I said. Just his name once. He heard me. I watched him hear me, the way his head turned fractionally in my direction, even while the rest of him held perfectly still. "Not here," I said. "Not in my kitchen, not with everything I built under his hands." Something returned in his face. Not softness, not hesitation. Something closer to arrival, as though a part of him that had been somewhere else for a long time had just come back to the room. He looked down at Decker and said, in a voice so quiet it barely reached me, "If you move in this city again, there won't be enough of you left to move somewhere else." Then he stepped back. His men took Decker. The room exhaled. Later, much later, after the statements and the boarding of the window, and Ivor's shoulder being seen to by a paramedic he kept trying to dismiss, I swept my own kitchen floor, because I needed to hold the broom and feel the floor solid under my feet and know the room was still mine. Nikolai stayed, not hovering, not managing, just present in the way that had started to feel specific to him, occupying space without crowding it, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than people realize. When the last person left and the door was closed, and the kitchen was quiet, except for the creak of the old building settling, I put the broom away and leaned both hands on the prep counter and let my head drop for a moment, because the whole night had finally reached my bones and I needed somewhere to put it. He came to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, not touching. "I can have this fixed before you open tomorrow," he said. "You can't fix tonight," I said. "Tonight already happened." He was quiet for a moment then. "No, but I can try to build what comes after it." I lifted my head and looked at him. Really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself look too directly since the waterfront market in November. The particular shape his face had in the low kitchen light, tired and present, and asking something he wouldn't put into words, because he was not, I had learned, a man who asked easily for things he wasn't sure he was allowed to want. "What does that mean?" I said. "From you?" "It means I stay," he said, "if that's something you want. Not because you need protection. Because I know what you are, and I would like to be in the same room as it." I looked at him for another moment. Then I reached up and touched the side of his face. The way you touch something you've been deciding about for a long time. And he went very still. The good still, the kind that means someone is trying not to move in case they break something careful. "I'm not going to be easy," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to keep my own hours and my own lease and my grandmother's recipe and my name over my own door. I know that too. And if you ever have someone look into my affairs without telling me first again—" "I won't," he said, and then quietly, almost carefully, "Sparrow." It was the first time. It came out low, like he'd been holding it back, long enough that it arrived differently than either of us expected. "What?" I said. "It's what I've been calling you," he said, "in my head, since November." I looked at him. Because you move like something that doesn't need much room to fly," he said, "and because you fed a man who had given up on being fed." I kissed him before he could find another sentence, because that one was already more than I knew where to put. He kissed me back the way he'd started to eat, with intention. Like someone who had been relearning what it meant to take something offered without waiting for it to become a threat. A year later, Colette will tell anyone who stands still long enough that the whole story started with a bowl of soup handed through an SUV window, which is technically accurate and completely misses the point. People tell the simple version because the simple version is easier to hold. What actually happened was slower and stranger and cost more than either of us had planned to spend. What actually happened was I made bread for a man who had stopped believing bread was safe, and then I made it again. And then I showed up in a kitchen with my grandmother's starter in a cooler bag and my conditions in the front pocket of my apron, and I didn't bend a single one of them. And he showed up in my market line and waited like everyone else, and said you choose in a way that meant something different than those two words usually mean. The bakery is mine. My name is on the lease and on the door, and on the health certificate framed in the front hall, and the starter lives in my kitchen at home, in a jar that now says, "Still do not touch this," 'cause some things survive everything and deserve to be marked accordingly. Nikolai comes after close, most nights. He dries the pans badly, and I have stopped correcting him because some arguments are not worth the energy. He eats everything I put in front of him now, not without history, not without the occasional meal where something in the smell or the setting takes him back to a table 4 years ago, and I can see it in the set of his shoulders. On those nights I just talk, about ordinary things, about the day's bread and the flour delivery, and what Colette said to the smoked fish man at the market last week. I talk until I see his shoulders come down. He calls me Sparrow in private, and by my name everywhere else, and I call him by his, and nothing softer, because that's the agreement we arrived at without having to discuss it, the way the real agreements always go. The city bent around him like water around stone, for years, before I ever handed him a bowl through a car window. It still does, that hasn't changed, but there is a kitchen on a North End block in Halifax where he eats without bracing for damage, and his name is not above the door, and he doesn't expect it to be. He did not forget where the bread came from, He did not share it, and he has not, in all the time since, let me go.